From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and ahead for you today with his weekly grain market segment, K-State's Dan O'Brien. He'll comment on the impact of that devastating storm in the Corn Belt earlier this week on corn and soybean production there, and how much of a factor that could be in the price trends ahead. Also today, K-State's Romulo Lollato. He'll go over the new report out from K-State on wheat variety performance as a grazing resource. Field trials this year have identified those varieties which excel for the dual purposes of grazing and grain production. And later, we'll hear from K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. All that and more coming your way next on this Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Welcome once again to Agriculture Today. Taking up the grain markets once more to start this Friday edition, we bring in grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, along with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. And we are at no lack of things to talk about this week for sure, Dan. The USDA coming out earlier this week with its first survey-based crop production report, and the numbers were decidedly higher for virtually all the row crops.
They were, but as soon as weather conditions came in, particularly a major storm rolling through Iowa and other states, but particularly Iowa, as soon as that happened with quite a bit of crop damage, followed up by a forecast of drier weather for the next couple of weeks, I guess we'd say the market took that into account, but then moved on in its focus. I won't say discounted it, but moved on in its focus to trying to assess the crop damage. And that was a game changer. So I would not say the report was dead on arrival, but as soon as that storm hit on the 10th, 11th, then the report on the 12th, well, the numbers for corn production and probably soybean production, which we're not talking so much about, both of those are, quote, subject to change. And we've seen that here in the markets since that, quote, bearish report came out, have been moving to the higher side. Closed yesterday, D's corn at $3.38, had been $3.23 thereabouts. D's corn up 11.5 cents. Yeah. And on the close, November soybeans up 16.5. Even wheat followed suit, probably in sympathy somewhat, and with some decent exports. September up 7.25. That's hard red winter wheat. So the market's perspective has changed, and we have a number of other factors. I think by the time you bring them all together, there are some points of positive news to provide some support for the market that bears looking at, that probably keep us from just going into the long, slow slide into harvest from where we're sitting right now.
And what you've been referencing here is what they're calling that derecho storm, which strafed Iowa, parts of Illinois, even further east. And the eventual upshot of that isn't fully told, is it? We're still assessing as an industry just how much damage was brought to bear there.
Well, that's correct. When you look at the amount of corn to be harvested in Iowa this year, projected, again, the same August 1st dated NASS number, 13.55 million acres. And there's a number that came out that seems as credible as any, stating that 43% of the crop acreage in Iowa was affected by this. So that's more than a third. That's almost half. So 43% of 13.5 million acres is about 5.8 million acres. I mean, if we use that, 5.8 million acres, if it's 10 bushel loss, that's 58 million bushels. If it's 100 bushel loss, it's 580 million bushels. It is interesting that the projected yield for Iowa was 202 bushels per acre. So if they lost 25% of their yield, they'd be at 50 bushels an acre. So we just do the math, 50 bushels per acre times 5.8 million acres, you're 2, 3, 4, 500 million bushels. Now, the USDA's U.S. production numbers, I think it came out at 15.278 billion bushels. When I first saw that, I thought, well, we might as well left it at 15 because that's probably how much crop loss we could have, about 270, 300 million bushels. So if you just use that as a metric, you get back to 15 billion, and anything more than that gets us to 14.8, 14.7, etc. If it's really rough, down to 14.5. So in that supply-demand balance sheet for corn, it came in with a projection of record high 2.75 billion bushels. And so if everything else is the same, ceteris paribus, everything else is assumed the same, and you just lost 500 million bushels of yield out of Iowa, if that came about, then we'd be down to 2.25 billion bushels. The total number of bushels in Iowa projected to be 2.7 billion bushels. To lose 1 billion bushels, to really get serious about this, to lose 1 billion bushels and take us from 15.28 down to 14.28, what's the yield on a 5.8 million acres to lose 1 billion bushels? So if we get that and you get below 2 billion bushels, then you've changed the game. So most of the guesstimates from that storm and its corn damage are somewhat less than that. Again, a more tepid 400 or 500. The question's been asked, well, when will we actually find out what that is? The USDA NASS will go out and do objective yield surveys in the field in the September report coming out the first week in September. But by the time we get into October, November, then we'll know what we actually have. And so there's damage to corn.
Soybeans are also to be considered here, though.
Soybeans, they don't have the same stock as corn does. But for Iowa, soybeans, 9.3 million acres to be harvested. They lost 40% of that. That's somewhere over 4 million acres, 4.2, something like that. Let's say 4 million acres. Projected yield of 46 bushels per acre. They lose 10 bushel an acre on 4 million acres, 400 million bushels, more than that. Then what you do, you take the soybean number that the USDA projected, record high, 4.425 billion bushels in the U.S., take 400 million off of that. Well, now it's down to 4. Anything more, you're getting a 3.9, 3.8. Then you're starting to get serious because now you take that balance sheet, you lose 400 million off of 610 million projected carryout. That's a big deal. Now you are enforcing rationing because the market didn't want to go that low. That's back to the old days of beans in the teens. So we're really focused on corn, but maybe the bigger risk, as big a risk to the market to changing the game, is probably on the soybeans from what happened in Iowa.
Now, in a moment, we want to have you pass along, based on all of this new USDA information and otherwise, your latest price projections associated with corn, beans, even wheat. But we're going to move away from crop destruction and to the demand side with your export update. And there are some enthusing developments there, to be certain, Dan.
For the week ending August the 6th, corn exports 52.5 million bushels for that week. Strong amount. The big thing is something that makes our grain sorghum folks enthusiastically positive, is that for that week we had just under 19 million bushels of grain sorghum shipped. And a lot of times we're looking at 2 and 3 million bushels. Well, here, kaboom, 19 million. And you've got a good amount of purchases coming from China and unknown buyers. So we don't know, it could all be from China. 1.7 million metric tons for that. And that's about 40% of the way to what we have this year already. And we haven't got into that marketing here yet. So grain sorghum exports doing well. Grain sorghum basis reflecting that in a lot of locations, doing pretty good, doing very good actually. For wheat, our pace for wheat exports is as strong as any time since 2012. We're at the top of our range of where we've been all through all those years for both hard red winter wheat and hard red spring also. And for soybean exports, basically 41 million bushels, week ending August 6th. The bigger news is that the USDA came in and sharply raised their projection. We're projected to export 1.65 billion bushels of soybeans this year. They moved higher, the one for next year, to 2.125. So before this crop damage hit, there was a lot of positive on the export demand side. I think it's fair to say that we've taken a step away from that heading for harvest low scenario that we were in before that storm hit.
And that is reflected in the aforementioned price probability projections that you put out in your weekly notes. And to capsulize it, you're generally more optimistic than is the USDA.
The USDA came out and projected prices for the next marketing year starting September 1 at $3.10. The way things are shaping up, to me, it looks like there's a higher possibility of being about $3.65 to $3.70. And if things really fall in terms of tight supplies, better demand, $3.85 to $4. For soybeans, the USDA projected $8.35. To be fair, probably something closer to $8.55 with acreage and yield cutbacks. Possibility if things really come out rougher than we're anticipating, $9.25 to $9.35. For wheat, the USDA projected $4.50 through a combination of crop problems to the north and better exports coming in. We could go $4.70, $4.90. So I guess call me Mr. Optimist, whatever, but there seem to be things lining up when you look at historical price relationships that are better than the USDA. One thing I'd finish on, when you look at current U.S. crop prices relative to our historical stocks-to-use ratios, what we've been doing, every one of these crops has taken a nosedive to the negative. We are way off of those relationships. And is that COVID-19? Is it pessimism about the economy? I'm not sure what all it is, but our prices all across the board have taken a fall off the cliff, lower move relative to where they've been in the past at these same levels of stocks to use. So what does that say? Well, it could say that we're too pessimistic right now by the time we get to the next 12 months, but we'll have to see.
Dan's notes worth a look, producers. He's posted those on the agmanager.info website, as he does weekly, agmanager.info. As always, Dan, we appreciate the time.
Thank you, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Continuing on now on this Agriculture Today, more for you wheat growers, as our guest and colleagues have just finished evaluating wheat variety performance in Kansas for grazing forage purposes now. And this is handy information for those of you who are inclined to pasture wheat this fall and maybe into the spring. Joining us once more, wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato, K-State Research and Extension, who co-authored this new publication, fresh out of K-State, on wheat variety, date of first hollow stem, fall forage yield, and grain yield. And you're drawing from field trials, Romulo, that you've conducted this past year.
Hi, Eric. Yeah, so this is actually a publication that we put out every year, right? And we update it in a yearly basis. And essentially what it is, it's a comparison of how different wheat varieties, either commercial varieties or lines that are coming down the pipeline, how they are faring in a dual-purpose system. And is there an yield penalty on that dual-purpose system as compared to a grain-only system? So essentially, in this specific case, right, this year we had 28 entries. These trials, they are usually conducted near Hutchinson, which could be considered kind of the northern edge of where the majority of the wheat is grazed in Kansas, right? As we get north from there, we see less and less wheat being grazed. So essentially what we do is we plant 3 trials. One of them is planted as a grain-only trial. So it's planted at the optimum date for grain-only, sometime there in that mid-October timeframe, at a little bit lower seeding rate, probably about 60 pounds of seed per acre there. The other 2 trials, they're planted to the exact same varieties, and they are planted in a dual-purpose situation. So we have a little bit more nitrogen up front to make sure that there is enough forage production. And we're planted earlier. We planted about the September 15th or September 20th timeframe. And in that trial, we evaluated different things, right? And the reason we have two of those is that one of them, we do several destructive measurements, including biomass, so we can know how much dry matter these varieties are producing, and first hollow stem, so we can know how long in the spring we can graze each one of these varieties. And then the other one, we do simulated grazing. So we go there time and time again with a commercial mower, and we clip those plots pretty short several times in the season. And then we go for grain yield. So the goal there is to try to understand how these different varieties bounce back from that stress of the foliage removal, right, that we're simulating a grazing in those varieties.
So you are obviously evaluating several variables here. And is any one of those more important than the other? You mentioned the date to first hollow stem, for instance, the forage productivity. What do you think that producers should concentrate on amongst all of these data points, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the three most important things that we need to keep in mind if we are in a dual purpose production scenario are these two that you mentioned, right? Forage production, because we want to know how these different varieties are differing in their fall amount of forage produced. Date of first hollow stem, because that can give us up to a couple weeks or even in some cases up to 3 weeks more of grazing in the fall. So remember, let's think about it. What is the date of first hollow stem? It's when that growing point in the spring starts to come out and the crop starts to elongate the shoot, right? And so first hollow stem, that growing point is reaching the ground level. So the later it takes to reach the ground level, the more time the cattle have to graze in the spring, right? Simply because if they're grazing past that point, they're actually grazing out the heads, not only the foliage. And so there's quite a bit of yield penalty there. So those two things are very important: amount of fall forage produced, date of first hollow stem with preferably later varieties. And then the third one that we also evaluate is how these varieties respond to that stress. Some varieties might have a very large yield penalty. Other varieties, they might be able to tiller quite well after that grazing or the simulated grazing is stopped and still yield very similarly to a non-grazed situation, even though we're imposing that stress. So again, it's important to know those three things, right? Forage production, date of first hollow stem, and how these varieties are yielding after grazing.
Now, as one looks at the data in this publication, you are expressing that forage productivity how?
So the forage productivity, we actually clip the plants, right? And we bring all that biomass to a dryer. We oven dry that. And so we're reporting that in pounds of dry matter per acre. In the case of this last fall here, it really ranged, there was a pretty wide range. It ranged from about 400 pounds of dry matter per acre in the lowest forage yielding variety, all the way to close to 2,000 pounds of forage produced per acre.
That's
right?
quite a range.
Dry matter. It is. And so it is very important to know, right, and to have this information whenever you are taking that decision. So this range, in some years we might see a range like this. Some varieties that just perhaps are not tillering as well as some others, or just don't produce as much biomass in the fall. Usually there is a greater effect of the weather. So a dry fall or lack of nitrogen or a cold fall might impact forage production more than the differences between the varieties. But this year we saw a considerable amount of differences in between the varieties as far as fall forage dry matter.
Now, you do, in the publication, once again, identify those varieties which tend to stand out in the important categories here: forage yield, first hollow stem, and, again, the grain yield in dual-purpose systems. So producers can have a pretty firm idea of which varieties rise to the top in all of these respects, correct?
Yeah, so whenever we talk about the forage dry matter, last season in Hutchinson at least, there was a couple of varieties from Oklahoma State that did quite well. Those were Gallagher and Smith's Gold. Also, we had a couple of varieties from Polanski seed that did quite well. Those were Paradise and Rockstar. And then 3 Westbred varieties that also did quite well. Those were 4269, WB4303, and WB4792. So all those varieties did quite well as far as forage production. But the date of first hollow stem, it was not too different, right? So there was a pretty narrow range. Essentially, this year, within a week, all the varieties had reached first hollow stem. And part of that is because in Hutchinson there was enough moisture and temperatures warmed up about in the early part of March. And so by mid-March, all these varieties had already reached first hollow stem. So there was, so again, considerable amount of differences in forage. But then first hollow stem, at least this year, they were relatively similar.
But the point that producers need to take home here is that the recovery of these varieties from that grazing is very specific to the variety. So producers need to keep that well in mind as they go about selection of varieties for this intent.
Yes, and then the way that producers would look at that, at least in that publication, right, is take a look at the grain yield of those varieties under grain-only conditions, see the ranking, and then ask yourself, did this ranking change when we go to the dual-purpose situation? If the ranking was sustained, it means that the varieties that were doing well under grain-only also did well under dual-purpose. But what we saw this year, and that's typically what we see kind of year in and year out, is that sometimes in the dual-purpose situation, we have different varieties showing up towards the top, right? That means that, again, that bouncing back from grazing, that recovery from grazing is showing up whenever we look at the ranking of those varieties in that dual-purpose situation. And it was pretty clear here this year. We had only 3 varieties that were what we call that top-yielding group for the grain-only, right? Those were Rockstar, WB4269, and WB4699, again, as a grain-only situation. Whenever we went to the dual-purpose situation, those 3, they were still there, right? They were still belonging to the top-yielding group, which was good to see. But then there was some other varieties showing up as well, like Showdown from Oklahoma State University, Bentley, and Double Stop, all of these varieties from the OSU program that are part of that Grazing and Grain program. AM Cartwright and Guardian were also varieties that showed up towards the top in that dual-purpose scenario, right? So again, just a reminder to growers there that whenever we see these, whenever we see varieties coming up towards the top in the dual-purpose situation, probably a good indication that those varieties might be more adapted to those conditions.
Once more, all of this is conveniently captured in this fresh new publication out of K-State. It's this year's edition of the Wheat Variety Evaluations for Grazing Potential. And you say it's easy to get a hold of, Romulo.
Yeah, so actually, if growers simply type first hollow stem Kansas, like in Google, it should show up there. But at the KSRE bookstore online, and of course, that's available through my Twitter and my Facebook accounts. Those would be at KSU Wheat. So in either one of those venues, just Googling it or just going to the KSRE bookstore or my Twitter or Facebook account from the Wheat Extension Program, growers should be able to access that publication and hopefully can help them take a better decision when selecting their variety for a dual-purpose situation.
All kinds of ways to access the information. We'd encourage wheat producers intending on grazing wheat to take full advantage of this information. And Romulo, always a pleasure to visit. We'll talk again very soon with wheat planting time creeping up on us. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
Wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato, K-State Research and Extension, along with us, and we'll return with more for you after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, recently awarded contracts to purchase up to 8 million low-frequency radio identification ear tags. Those will help increase overall animal disease traceability in cattle by providing free RFID tags to interested producers. The contract allows APHIS to purchase additional tags each year for up to 5 years. Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs Greg Eibach said that the RFID devices will provide states and the cattle industry with the best opportunity to rapidly contain the spread of high economic impact diseases. Now, the tags will be provided to animal health officials in each state and will be distributed for use in replacement breeding cattle at no cost to the producer. RFID low-frequency official calf hood vaccination button tags are available for brucellosis-vaccinated animals, and official 840 white button tags will be available for non-vaccinated heifers. The contracts for the RFID tags were awarded to 3 American tag companies, Allflex, Datamars, and Ytex. Contracting with all 3 will allow the USDA to procure the number of tags needed to meet the industry volume equivalent to the number of replacement heifers in the U.S. As part of its overall effort to increase traceability in cattle, APHIS distributed more than 1 million RFID tags to 38 states between January and July of this year. Each USDA state veterinarian distributes the tags then in a way that best serves their respective cattle industries. And the USDA has energy programs that can help with upgrades at many different types of rural businesses, including things like small-scale meat processing establishments, which have gained more interest as a result of the pandemic. Here's more on that from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA has energy programs that are not exclusive to small-scale meat processors, but do have applicability.
One that you probably don't really ever even think about when you're thinking small-scale meat processing and thinking about renewable energy. But we do offer our Rural Energy for America, or referred to as REAP. This promotes the use and incorporation of renewable energy systems and energy efficiency improvements into agricultural operations.
Andy Jamalowitz is with the Rural Business Cooperative Service.
You could use that program for the construction, expansion, modernization, retrofitting of a facility, and it does have its benefits by having USDA and they're offering the guarantee.
He says his office has noted an uptick in interest in these programs over the last decade.
As people, consumers and producers have both become a lot more interested and engaged in the local and regional food systems.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And an individual well-known in Kansas agricultural circles has announced his retirement upcoming in March of 2021. From the Kansas Soybean Association and Kansas Soybean Commission, Kenlon Johannes has announced his intention to retire in the spring of next year. Kenlon has accomplished a great deal in the soybean industry. 20 years at Kansas Soybean under the Kansas Soybean Board of Directors' direction. He manages and implements production and utilization research, domestic and international market development, and education projects for the Commission and lobbying programs for the association. A committee comprised of 7 Kansas farmer leaders have initiated a search for Kenlon's successor. A new CEO of Kansas Soybeans will be expected to be named in early of 2021. Researchers here at Kansas State University are preparing to take the next step forward in improving the end-use quality of wheat varieties. On the strength of a new USDA grant, they'll be employing cutting-edge gene editing technology to develop wheat's milling and baking traits. Marcia Boswell has more on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Kansas State University officials say a $650,000 grant from the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture has spurred a partnership with a Canadian university to improve wheat using genome editing technology. Edward Akanoff, a wheat geneticist who will lead K-State's work on this project, said the university will join with researchers at the University of Saskatchewan in using genome editing technology to improve productivity and nutrition in the world's wheat lines. Genome editing, he said, relies on a technology better known by its abbreviation, CRISPR. Akhenov says CRISPR is a powerful and extremely precise molecular tool capable of making targeted changes in genetic code. It allows us to produce novel variants of genes that have improved properties and create a positive impact on the traits of interest. Using genome editing to target genes that are linked to valuable agronomic traits allows researchers to accelerate the development of crops that produce higher yields, are more nutritious, or yield higher quality grain. Akhenov says our project will use the capabilities of CRISPR-Cas, referring to use of the technology with an associated protein, to empower traditional breeding strategies. Integrating this tool into modern breeding practices can substantially speed up the rate of genetic gain by accelerating the identification of agronomic genes, broadening genetic diversity, and reducing the time required for traits introgression or transfer into the adapted germplasm. Together, the research groups will use CRISPR to introduce domesticated traits into wild wheat relatives. Akhenov says these efforts may pave new ways for broadening the genetic diversity of modern bread wheat by creating newly domesticated varieties of wild crops. He says our combined efforts should help to establish the CRISPR-Cas technology as a precision breeding tool in the wheat breeder's toolbox for characterizing, developing, and transferring traits into their breeding programs. Akhenov's research team at K-State has previously used CRISPR-based genome editing to create novel variants of genes and develop wheat lines with increased grain size and weight and number of grains per head. He said that the new project will also test a new strategy to create novel trait variation by mutating a region of the wheat genome that is responsible for regulating genes tied to nitrogen uptake, carbon fixation, growth, and nutrient remobilization. Akhenov says currently there is a limited understanding of the range of possible variation for these traits that can be generated by editing these regulatory regions of genes. The project will collaborate closely with NIFA's Wheat Coordinated Agriculture Project, the International Wheat Yield Partnership, and the NIFA IWIP Winter Wheat Breeding Innovation Hub, which was recently established at K-State. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. After this, you're listening to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Agriculture Today closes out now with an update on Kansas agricultural weather. And along with us once again is Research and Extension climatologist here at K-State, Mary Knapp. And Mary, in our recent conversations here, you've been reporting on quite favorable rainfall in places around Kansas that really, truly needed moisture. But the reality is we're still stuck with drought conditions in many a location around the state.
Right. We still have severe drought out in western Kansas, particularly along the Colorado border, going from Sherman County southwards. And feeding off of that, also, we have moderate to abnormally dry conditions that move inwards. The other area is southeast Kansas, where they continue to have moderate drought and abnormally dry conditions. The rains were sufficient in parts of southeast Kansas, particularly along the Missouri border, for some slight improvement in that area. By no means has it been erased, but they carved a little bit more away from it, again, mainly on the eastern side of that region. We were really aided by cooler to near normal temperatures for the week. We weren't seeing those really hot, windy days that tend to suck every drop of moisture out of anything that has it, but it was still hot. We had some 100-plus temperatures, again, mainly in the western parts of the state. Those were counterbalanced by lows in the 50s across all of the region. The coolest spot was actually in north-central Kansas. Marysville hit 52 for a low. So, again, not too far from normal temperatures. The warmest division was about 0.8 of a degree warmer than normal. The coolest was over 2 degrees cooler than normal. So, again, a fairly cool week overall.
And there has been rainfall over the past few days, but that's been somewhat restricted to certain areas of Kansas.
Right, and it's been very, very isolated. There was a strip in western Kansas from north central down to parts of southeast Kansas that had some fairly impressive rainfall amounts, but it was a very narrow band. And we saw it in eastern Kansas with our storms that we had on Wednesday. Parts of Dickinson County had over 2 inches of rain. You get to Manhattan, we had 0.02 of an inch of rain, and that's not that far of a distance between Abilene and Manhattan, but that was the rainfall gradient that we saw. Not anything in the outlook that will change that. Most of these storms have been firing up along a frontal boundary that's been stationary across the state, and that boundary drifts north and south a little bit, and where the storms form follow that boundary shift. The outlook for next week is for drier than normal statewide. And again, that doesn't mean that somebody might not catch one of those bigger showers, but their neighbors around them are likely to not see anything at all. The quantitative precip forecast for the week ending next Friday is favoring the heavier moisture amounts to be in the western half of the state. Parts of Morton County into the Oklahoma Panhandle may see as much as 1.5 inches of moisture. You move over to southeast Kansas, where 1.5 inches would be just about what they should see for the week, and they'll be lucky if they get 1/4 inch.
To these cooler temperatures that are expected to accompany that weather pattern next week, and how that will likely affect our row crop progression.
Well, the cold front has been moving through basically today and will settle in place for most of next week. What they're calling for is temperatures in the 80s for highs and in the 60s for low. So not quite as cold as we've seen in some of the other ones. And that's really pretty close to ideal temperatures for soybeans. Maybe a little bit cool on the sorghum side, but certainly not anything to cause major stress to the crop. The lows, again, are supposed to stay above 60. And it's when those low temperatures get down into the low 50s that it tends to halt the development on the sorghum. So from the temperature standpoint, that's going to be pretty favorable growing conditions for our row crops that are out there. For those that are looking to fill that soil profile in anticipation of planting winter wheat, this is not going to help very much at all.
But we've time yet to go before those drills roll, so hopefully something will happen in the coming weeks in that respect. Quickly here, though, as those temperatures cool down, particularly at night, that would suggest lower humidities, and there's a plus in that in as far as discouraging disease development on our row crops.
Right, and that has been an issue even in areas that haven't picked up significant rainfall, because what we've been seeing is day-long cloudy events with the high humidities dew on the grass in the morning. That's also dew on the crop leaves, and that tends to favor the development of those foliar diseases. Lower humidities are going to make that a less favorable environment for that continued development. So that is kind of the half-full view of the glass.
And the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day forecasts will take us out of the month of August into September. What are those telling us?
Well, the 8 to 10 is favoring, again, near normal temperatures statewide. The increased chance for warmer than normal in the west, particularly along the Colorado border. Increased chances of cooler than normal in the southeast. Again, we're getting into our fall season. We're just about there now, and that will again favor a gradual cooling for our average highs and our average lows. In fact, there will be a new update on the fall outlook that will be released next week, and we'll certainly give you an update of what might be showing in the crystal ball for the September, October, and November timeframe.
Well, that will be most definitely among our talking points as we get together next Friday right here. So until then, Mary, many thanks. Enjoy the weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp is a climatologist with K-State Research and Extension and with us each week right here. And we bid you a good weekend likewise and invite you to rejoin us right here on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.